Alright, good people, we are back. It's the third episode of season 3.
The thinking.
It's Pinky and the Brain. You should get it. We're looking at US imperialism with its ally, or its brainchild, Israel. Of course, they are on the attack. Where? Middle East. Surprise, surprise. It's Iran. I'm sure all of you have been following the story, but do you understand how you're being positioned? Do you understand the nuances? Do you get the details of what is really happening? Or you just, lapping it up? But I know we have the best listeners. They're quite critical and they're thinkers and they dig in deep when it comes to this stuff. So I'm sure that this episode is going to make you think a little bit more, right? So do check it out. It's happening. We're looking at how the US Venezuelan weird military operation was covered. As you recall, they swooped in, abducted President Maduro, and next thing, that story just faded. Why did it fade away? Why? So anyway, these are the type of things. We've got guest appearances from, really, really smart political commentators, as well as journalists. And we've got the entire team. My boys, Matiberi, Isaac, were out in the streets of Johannesburg, just getting in touch with the people, right? Hearing what the people have to say, what's happening, what are their views, right? Uncensored, unfiltered, unlike some radio stations. And we have Letsta, aka Naledi, looking at social media. JB is in the archives. She's gone in way, way back to understand what? International law. And then, of course, my usual craziness is all over the episode. You will hear that. An interesting skit. I hope you like it. Do check out the episode. After all, this is the only podcast to listen to. And this is the only episode that will actually give you critical media insights on what's happening with US and Israel versus everybody.
Let me light myself a BB. Yes. Heavenly Father, forgive me, for I do not mean to speak out of turn, as I reflect on the words of your servant. Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. I suppose the people had nothing left to do but rebel.
Thousands of people have been marching from Westminster to the US Embassy in central London, demanding an end to the war in Iran.
The world has awakened because Iran, the lion, is awake. We are mourning the martyrdom of our leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. What is happening is that we have always been against the oppression of people, and this time, Iran has not remained silent.
Venezuela soil! Hands off Venezuela soil! No, no vote for oil!
I call for them to stop. Let the Venezuelans govern themselves.
I suppose the people had nothing left to do but rebel. We are left with nothing but our voices as weapons. In a world where rules are for the oppressed and merely a suggestion for the moneyed and powerful, even the people out there can see what's going on.
My name is Matibedi, this is my brother Isaac. Yeah, thanks, Doc. So my first question is, do you think all people are equal under national and international law?
No, I feel like international people can break some boundaries when they in a low guarded place like SA.
True.
Yeah.
Okay. And you, Fram?
Yeah,
Do you think?
Nah, I don't think.
You don't think so?
Not under international law.
Yeah, why is that?
Because you're not protected the same if you go into, a country you don't have citizenship in.
True.
You feel me? Yeah.
No, I get you.
Never. With everything that's happening today in the world, how can that even be? And let's just narrow it down to South Africa, Gauteng, and even this area. We aren't equal. We're not equal.
The thing is, asikho equal. Yeah. Based on lessons and the way they treat us when it comes to law and everything. Yeah, asikho equal.
I don't think so. One, because of the political climate and how things have changed over the years. And whoever ends up being in power tends to want to dictate and dominate to the others.
Funny how neoliberal globalization was never about beautification, never about the melting of cultures as they once sold it. Instead, it opened the eyes of the people across the world to the wicked ways of the few who rule with impunity. Here, there, and everywhere.
7 days ago, Israeli and U.S. forces struck without warning, beginning their relentless bombing campaign in Iran. Washington claims to be on the side of the Iranian people, but civilians were among the first casualties of the war.
There are people that say, well, the Prime Minister of Israel dragged Donald Trump into it. And as somebody that's been friends with him over 30 years, nobody drags Donald Trump into anything, number one, but I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, you're right. I mean, that's ridiculous. Donald Trump is the strongest leader in the world. He does what he thinks is right for America. He does also what he thinks is right for future generations. And frankly, we're partners in that effort because I've devoted my life to securing the life of the one and only Jewish state.
Can you give us an idea of what unconditional surrender looks like to you? I mean, what do you want from Iran?
I said unconditional, not conditional. I said unconditional. It's where they cry uncle or when they can't fight any longer, there's nobody around to cry uncle.
I got a strange message on Signal from somebody who said that they had all of the police interrogation videos from the Benjamin Netanyahu investigation. And they had been investigating Netanyahu since 2016 for charges of corruption, that is to say, trading on his position as prime minister to get money in all sorts of favors, jewelry for his wife, very expensive Cuban cigars, hundreds of millions of dollars in forgiveness of certain loans.
What is to become of them? Shall we protest as they did in the 1700s for a revolution? And again in the 2000s, when the axis of evil led to Iraq being bombed under false claims.
Do you think the United States is a powerful country?
I think they used to be very powerful, but in this last 2-3 years, they've been demystified.
They get the power through other countries, mostly African countries, because we're the ones who provide them with the minerals that they need for them to forge the weapons to destroy us.
Yeah, I think they are.
And your reasons for that?
Because of their superpower.
Okay.
Yeah, they're amongst the superpower in the world.
Yo, Ann. Ann. What are you doing, man? Upemi pipi manje.
Should I tell him? There's no need for me to smoke, Bibi. The Iranians are already doing a fine job of that themselves.
What do you make of Israel?
I think that they are bullies, and it's such a small country, but its influence is outsized in terms of geopolitical developments.
I even saw a video of some Israelites, kids, busy praising that they must kill Palestinians and everything. Like, in their eyes, they are less than human.
I think it's the promised land of God, you know? That's what I think about Israel.
You've heard what the people are saying, man. I think the team's ready to deliver the next episode. Toss that thing.
It's showtime. Hello, good people. Welcome to TTBIA, the thinking behind it all. This is where we decode and break down media text, searching for hidden messages and underlying meanings. We ask critical questions. Who is the author targeting? What makes us receptive or skeptical of the news? And when the occasion calls for it, we separate fact from fiction. We do this to become more responsible, informed news consumers, and in turn, better activists in our own spaces.
On the front pages with your host Malusi Ngala.
There is nothing like war to get the global community going. We are so touched that we best show our support or opposition to it by posting I know it all content online. I mean, it's either that or it gets real. Really real. Yeah, we check who has died, flick to the next video, and express how BBL is the answer to your life's problems. All the while, local economies are virtually non-existent, and globally, surprise, surprise, oil and gas prices are volatile, and countries cannot survive without these energy sources. Did I just hear someone say climate change? Climate change? Climate change? Climate change? It's pointless now to describe the world as crazy. It's the new normal, and even more new normals are going to happen as the world realigns. Well, in some cases, it is maybe not newness that they seek, but rather the world of old.
That's very nice.
Next, we have a number of executive orders for your attention, sir.
Okay.
From 1789 until 1947, our nation won some of its greatest military victories under the direction of a Secretary of War operating within a Department of War. Today, with this executive order, you will authorize the current Secretary of Defense and the current Department of Defense to once again embrace this great lineage and once again be named the Secretary of War and the Department of War.
So this is something we thought long and hard about. We've been talking about it for months, Pete and I, and Dan. Dan came into the fold, by the way, a great general. He headed up the I wouldn't call it an attack. I'd almost call that one maybe even more than an attack. What he did with Iran, you saw the success of that operation. It was perfect. In fact, we have...
As usual, he is babbling. So let's skip to the rationale.
We've been talking about this Department of War. So we won the First World War, we won the Second World War, we won everything before that and in between, and then we decided to go woke and we changed the name to Department of Defense. So we're going Department of War.
No, they did not win those wars, but found themselves on the winning side. Those nasty Soviets won them the Second World War, but as I have intimated already, new normal versus the adage of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Anyway, this reverting to calling the United States Department of Defense the Department of War happened shortly after they, yes, Mr. President Donald Trump, you are correct on this count, attacked Iran in what the media dubbed the 12-Day War. Since that historic moment, inspiring as it was creatively, there was a reawakening. The promise of not being the president of wars and differentiating himself from neocons in the US political system came to nothing. Yep, mega folks, y'all thought warring would be a metaphor for fighting transgenderism exclusively. Think again. By late 2025, the second Trump administration was established and its intentions, at least in as far as being Zionist lapdogs goes, were founded and they were moving full steam ahead with capitalistic and imperial interests. Delusions? But hey, no need for me to betray y'all like your politicians do. Let me stick to the script. The new normal, right? This is what Al Jazeera had to say.
A show of force broadcast on Venezuelan TV as government media reports countrywide military exercises amid growing tension with the US. Venezuela's defense minister inspected air defense systems and warned Washington about any attempt to overthrow the government. The military exercises were held as President Nicolas Maduro signed into law a new national defense framework to integrate civilian and military forces.
Civilians were told to be war ready, encouraged to take up arms, and wait. An interesting deterrent strategy, especially when faced with a bully. Here is NBC explaining the "and then it got interesting" aspect of the story. Why? Because the bully was not deterred.
Tonight, President Trump with a clear message of force in the Caribbean.
We stopped all drugs virtually from coming in by sea. And we'll stop all drugs from coming in by land very shortly.
The Pentagon now sending the Navy's largest aircraft carrier strike group to the region, the USS Gerald R. Ford, nearly doubling the number of U.S. forces there and adding to the B-1 bombers flown near Venezuela's coast this week.
This game of cat and mouse played out for a few months, with the US claiming to be destroying drug trafficking networks, but providing no proof. As we were closing out 2025, The Guardian intimated that things were about to hit the fan. They ran a piece titled, "Trump's Shadow War in Venezuela Grows, but country's strongman leader still clings to power." The piece is fairly analytical, explaining that the US is averse to calling their military action a war, and that perhaps the drug issue is truly insignificant, exaggerated by the Americans, hence no proof. This headline would prove to be on the money though, because on the 3rd of January 2026, the world was treated to another stellar, articulate performance by US President Donald Trump. Bear with us.
Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice. This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history.
All inspiring and convincing, hey? Convincing indeed. CNN covered the event as such.
The breaking news this morning, President Trump says the U.S. carried out large-scale strikes on Venezuela overnight. He says its president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, have been captured and flown out of the country. Attorney General Pam Bondi says both of them have been indicted, and in a social media post says that they will, quote, soon face the full wrath of American justice.
Reuters wasted no time and was quick to let the world know what the deal was with this rather slick headline. Trump says US will run Venezuela after US captures Maduro. It is smooth because it centers the 47th American president as the figure at work. Meanwhile, dare I say, we know that he operates within a system. If you were not sure about Reuters' position on this story, fear not. They put together another piece titled Scenes from Venezuela as US Forces Capture Maduro. The article is a photo gallery of the US military operation, not law enforcement, depicting how the country's President Maduro is supposedly spectacularly apprehended. In a matter of hours, we got to know what the intentions were, because all along, we all, like obedient sheep, thought that this was a drug combating mission. This is what the BBC had to say.
President Donald Trump has announced that the United States intends to run Venezuela after it carried out a large-scale attack and claimed to have captured its president, Nicolas Maduro, flying him out of the country with his wife. Explosions were heard in the capital Caracas this morning, as well as in other Venezuelan cities. Nicolas Maduro has already been charged in New York with drugs and weapons offences.
And if there are those among you still a little unclear, here is Bloomberg to drive it home.
The Trump administration says it plans to control future sales of Venezuelan crude and hold the proceeds in U.S. accounts. The U.S. Energy Secretary has denied that the country's oil is being stolen, saying it was important for Washington to have control.
Have you noted the framing so far? It's matter of fact, and there is no questioning tone. It is business as usual, even from publications that notoriously have a quibble with or that usually criticize the Don. It's as though there is a checklist. Maduro gone? Check. Venezuela suitably freaked out? Check that. Oil? Super check. Pun intended. Sky News at least broke it down for global North audiences as to why this oil is of great importance to the US establishment.
Donald Trump has made no secret of the fact that oil was a major reason for taking out Nicolas Maduro. So what have American companies got to gain from Venezuelan oil? Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on Earth, an estimated 300 billion barrels lying untapped. That's about 17% of global reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and more than 3 times the US reserves. Now, the bulk of it lies in the central Orinoco belt, south of the Orinoco River, in oil fields covering around 50,000 square kilometres. And it's not just how much oil is there, but the type. It's extra heavy crude used for making diesel, asphalt, and as a raw material in petrochemicals. And because it's highly viscous, thick and sticky, it's more complex to extract and requires refinement. And crucially, while the US doesn't have large reserves of heavy crude, it does have lots of the refineries you need to deal with it.
That was pretty useful. It makes you think a little more than a Twitter subscriber under Elon Musk. But you're still inclined to think that there was no objection to this imperial quest. The Daily Maverick surprisingly got the ball rolling in South Africa. Referencing Reuters, but also the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, it titled the piece, "Trump says US will run Venezuela. South Africa calls on UN Security Council to urgently convene." See the juxtaposition? The US says one thing, but the South African government almost says that it isn't that easy, buddy. This warrants a serious discussion. The Mail and Guardian was more direct. US strikes on Venezuela. Capture of Maduro will make world less secure. Analysts. They are quoting what commentators think about the abduction of the Venezuelan president. But what about that verb though? Strikes. Not war or military language, but definitely one of the few headlines to indicate that this was violent action. However, even bolder was the Star, whose analytical piece was headlined, "What the US invasion of Venezuela means for international law and sovereignty." Newsroom Africa brought its viewers a bit of juicy but much needed gossip, as it highlighted how confused the current Government of National Unity configuration is in South Africa.
Further cracks have emerged within the Government of National Unity, this time owing to divergent views on the US invasion of Venezuela. ANC alliance partner, Freedom Front Plus leader Connie Mulder welcomed what he described as the end of the socialist failure in Venezuela. This contradicted the statement issued by the government condemning the attacks on Venezuela and capture of its leader Nicolas Maduro. As such, ANC Deputy Secretary General Nomvula Mokonyane criticized Mulder for his utterances.
If it wasn't so sadly pathetic, it would probably pass as comedic. Can't blame the 24-hour news broadcaster for running
with it though. As for Maduro, there would be no running. He was confined in a US jail for an impending trial, and the story faded from the headlines in the weeks to follow. There could be several reasons for that, but one notable one is this.
The United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated.
Most crucially, they will defend the genocidal Israeli state to the hilt. This would be the next quest for the Trump administration following its Venezuelan adventure. It decided to partner with the Zionist government of Israel to deal a decisive blow to Iran. In an article canvassing some of the initial happenings, The Guardian published a piece under the title, War on Iran, How the US-Israeli Bid for Regime Change Unfolded. Given that Trump rambled so many reasons, kudos to them for picking the regime change angle, though the foolish lie of an imminent threat is arguably a more salient point. Al Jazeera wasted no time in framing its approach in the classic humanitarian reporting style, documenting the devastation brought about by the bombs.
Israel is bombing Iran's capital for a second day. Large explosions have been heard across Tehran. Israel's military says it's carrying out what it's calling a broad wave of strikes in the heart of the Iranian capital. The U.S. and Israel launched coordinated strikes across Iran on Saturday, accusing Tehran of advancing its nuclear program. The Red Crescent says hundreds of people have been killed.
The war was supposed to last a few days, because these, after all, are mere Persians on camel and horseback, and not a nation of intellectuals with culture, whose women make up over 60% of university students and the majority of science graduates. So you can imagine what was in the minds of the ignorant lot when reports of retaliatory strikes came through. Here's what CBS had to say.
I've been verifying footage of Iran's strikes since the conflict began. Here's what the videos tell us about their strategy. In previous conflicts, we've seen Iran immediately go after Tel Aviv. They are still doing that. There are still missiles flying at the Israeli capital. What we're seeing more now, though, is that they're spreading out this damage throughout the region. They seem to be targeting U.S. assets throughout the Gulf, where America has allies and civilian infrastructure that's going to make the war more expensive. They can't compete with them soldier to soldier, but they are attacking U.S. military bases. U.S. soldiers were killed in an attack in Kuwait. They've gone after Bahrain, which is where the U.S. Fifth Fleet is. And we've seen videos of missile interceptions over the airport in Erbil, in the Kurdistan region in northern Iraq, where the U.S. has a military base. We've seen video of strikes at the U.S. Embassy in UAE and aftermath showing burn damage to the U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia. Although it insists it's not attacking those countries, Iran seems to be spreading out the damage as far and wide as it can throughout the region to degrade U.S. capabilities and make it more expensive in order to pressure those countries to end the war. The other thing that we're seeing is widespread use of Shahed drones. They're inexpensive to make, they have a long range, and they fly under the radar sometimes, which actually makes them more difficult to detect. We're already seeing in places like Bahrain that these drones have done significant damage, and that Iran seems to have plenty of them, that it's ready to spread throughout the region. Because the US primarily uses expensive missiles to shoot down these drones, and Iran can produce them so cheaply, it can potentially make this war very costly for the US and for its allies if the conflict drags on.
But so too was Israel under siege. Well, that is
what was frankly reported before the warmongers censored information about how Iran was standing up to the bullying. Here's Sky News reporting on the situation in the early days inside Israel.
Yeah, the air raid sirens have just started again here in Jerusalem. We've been getting a series of alerts about incoming attacks coming into Israel across a huge expanse of this land, north, south, towards Tel Aviv. I've just had a message saying missiles reported on their way into the West Bank of Israel, which is, of course, occupied territory, Palestine, as seen by most governments now.
But what did the Zionist squad have to show for success early on? Firstly, that they had killed Iran's long-term supreme leader.
Multiple Israeli officials tell ABC News that Israel has determined that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the joint U.S. and Israeli strikes on Tehran earlier today. U.S. officials have been informed by the Israelis, but have not independently confirmed that, according to two U.S. officials.
And also the killing of innocents. Even CNN could not shy away from this one.
Weeks since this war with Iran has been underway, the deadliest incident of civilian casualties was a strike that happened on an elementary school in southern Iran that killed scores of children. Tonight, a CNN analysis of that attack reveals evidence suggesting that the United States military was likely responsible for it.
In South Africa, what's the word? Well, similar to the Venezuelan saga, within the GNU this time around, the prominent dispute has been between the politically rank-dank, that is, the Democratic Alliance and the African National Congress, whose acronyms combined give us exactly the odor this coalition brings. Business Day chose to go with this headline after a parliamentary debate. DA brands ANC foreign policy schizophrenic in Iran debate. Yep, that was their takeaway from an entire session. No thought about how ironic it is that these parties supposedly continue to differ on major foreign policy positions, or that the SA government's position is perhaps wishy-washy. Based on this headline, you'd almost swear the DA is not part of government. Meanwhile, News 24 dropped the piece with a banal title. What does the US-Israel war on Iran mean for South Africa? But do not be misguided by its inability to grab attention. The zingers are in the article itself. Unsurprisingly, and with a measure of fake news energy, the writer advocates for accelerated privatization of state economic functions after telling the reader how dire the situation is, and of course that South Africa is backing a loser in Iran. Goodness, so much more could have been said. Like, for instance, what's been reported regarding trade routes.
The Middle East conflict is disrupting critical shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. It has forced major shipping companies to reroute their vessels away from the strait. Now, the crisis has forced ships traveling between Asia and Europe to take the longer route around the Cape of Good Hope.
The compulsion
to pursue further imperial interests.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation.
And Israeli intelligence services attempting to muddy the water even more.
As war spreads across the Middle East, the Kurds could once again find themselves in the middle. So who are the Kurds, and why do 35 million of them not have a state of their own? The Kurds have no friends but the mountains is a sad Kurdish proverb which is loaded with history and betrayal. They are widely considered to be the largest ethnic group without a state of their own. They live across this mountainous region known as Kurdistan, land of the Kurds. But Kurdistan is not a country. It's a geocultural region which is spread mainly across eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, western Iran, and parts of northern Syria.
Evidently, there's so much more to unpack from this Pinky and the Brain story. But for now, those are the headlights. Our job is to analyze the texts, contextualize the news events, and provide critical commentary.
The Stars with Naledi.
Hey, it's your girl Naledi, aka Lidsta. You know what's up. You know how the people in the entertainment industry always have some drama, and your girl's gonna keep you updated on some of the latest tea about some of your favorite celebrities, so you can think a little bit more about who you follow. So when I started working on this segment, I was actually excited. I was like, yes, please. Global chaos, politics, wars, Venezuela, Iran. So let's hear what celebs are saying, because surely people with millions of followers are speaking on something this serious. Babes, I did the research, and I was shocked, but also not shocked. Because what I found is this. It's not silence, it's selective energy. When Donald Trump announced that the US had captured Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, that was global headline news. The kind of news where you expect timelines to pause, where influencers stop and say, wait, let's actually understand this. But go online, very different energy. You've got influencers like Kylie Jenner posting selfies, campaigns, new drop coming soon, like nothing is happening. And the few who did say something, praying for everyone. This is so scary, oh my gosh. Hope everyone stays safe. No context, no explanation, no attempt to actually inform. And fans noticed. This is bigger than content. Do you even know what's going on? Y'all speak when it's trending. At the same time, fake videos were spreading, misinformation was getting millions of views, and influencers still reposting, still reacting, still moving fast, not thinking deep. So again, not silence, performance without understanding. Now let's move to Iran, because this is where things shift. When the conflict escalated, missiles, threats, global tension, this wasn't abstract anymore. A strike hit a school. Children were killed. Now pause, because this is important. Children, not soldiers, not politicians, children. And this is where you expect something different. You expect influencers to stop, to say something clear, something human. And some people did. Someone like Malala Yousafzai said, "The killing of civilians, especially children, is unconscionable. Every child deserves to live and learn in peace." Clear, direct, no confusion. But now go back to your timelines. The same influencers who post every day, who share everything. what did they say? Again, praying for everyone. This is heartbreaking. And the audience, not convinced. This is not enough. Children died and this is all you can say? Say something real. And then things got even more uncomfortable. Because while some people were mourning, others online were debating, is this retaliation? Did they deserve it? Who started it? And very few influencers stepped in to say, no, children are not part of this. That hesitation, that neutrality, that says something. Now, bring it back to Donald Trump, because this is where things get performative. When he escalated tensions with Iran, the internet didn't just analyze it, it turned into content. Jon Stewart called him our supreme misleader. Influencers jumped in immediately. TikTok reactions, memes, breakdowns. Even creators like Hassan Abi were reacting live, debating, arguing, turning it into real-time content. And the audience engaged. Not as policy, not as international law, as entertainment. So now war becomes watchable, shareable, viral. But when it comes to something like children being killed, suddenly it slows down. Now, let's bring it home. You've got voices like Zozibini Tunzi saying, we need humanity, compassion, and peace. And people respect that. But then you got some of your faves like Mehlali Ndamase, giving you soft life, flawless content. But when the world is literally burning, it's giving perfect lighting, zero commentary. And then Lasizwe Dambuza. Always first for trends, always first for entertainment, but when it's time to engage something serious, we're still waiting. And the comments? Say something real. This is giving PR. Stand for something. And honestly, they're not wrong. So now look at everything. Venezuela, content, confusion, vibes. Iran, children killed. Soft posts, careful language, avoidance. Trump, entertainment, memes, virality. South Africa, brand safe, controlled, selective. Same influencers, same platforms, different energy. So the real question is, why? Because influencers aren't just asking, what's happening? They're asking, how will this perform? Will it go viral, upset people, affect my brand deals? If it's safe, they speak. If it's risky, they soften it. If it's complicated, they aestheticize it. And that shapes everything. Because now, you're not experiencing the world directly. You're experiencing it through Instagram, TikTok, influencers, celebrities. And that means what they show you, what they avoid, how they frame things becomes your reality. So, go back to what I said in the beginning. Think a little bit more about who you follow.
What's the Word? An opinion with our guest speaker.
I'm Thabo Makwakwa. I produce and correspond for Sputnik Africa. Before that, I was working for independent media.
What are the prevailing South African news media narratives regarding US imperialism, specifically in the context of the 7th administration's military and diplomatic interventions?
The prevailing media narratives in South Africa would certainly have to do with how Trump does your taking of other countries, which is simply waging wars in the Middle East, in Nigeria, here in Africa. And how he's using aid to also influence their interest in Africa. You would look at how now, for example, they have filled the Eswatini jails with these US prisoners, very, very extremely dangerous prisoners who are just thrown into Africa. So these are some of the prevailing media narratives about this 47th administration under Donald Trump.
How do South African news narratives compare to social media discourse when discussing international politics and law?
I'll make one great example about what is happening in Palestine and Gaza specifically. You have social media, Twitter, your X, now saying there is genocide taking place. Kids are blown out by bombs. And then you'll have your media, your official huge media houses, publications, your CNN. You've got here in South Africa, your News 24, your Daily Maverick, that approaches the narrative differently in that they try to soften the actions of Israel in their military aggression against Palestinians. They will just say, for instance, there was a bomb that detonated when Gaza people, Palestinians, were trying to collect food somewhere, saying it was an Israeli identified bomb, trying to make it look like an accident, make the narrative look like, it wasn't intended to happen that way. It actually did. And then when you go, on the other hand, on TikTok, on social media, they will be telling you that Israeli forces went and bombed innocent people while waiting for aid, while waiting for food. So you have got these guys here who are led, your huge media houses who will sort of soften the narrative, while as ordinary people on Twitter call it like it is.
Explain whether you believe that South African journalists and media personalities are effectively connecting local socio-economic issues to global geopolitical shifts, or are they being treated as isolated events?
Honestly, I do think they're able to connect what is happening locally to the global tensions that are unfolding. And I'm saying this because South Africa, you would realize that up until recently, we have gone quiet about addressing the issues of land, simply because there's a new administration somewhere in the West that says, if you dare touch this matter, I am going to unleash whatever military aggression or sanctions or whatever they do, because they always do as they please. So our journalists are able to understand and connect these issues that are happening globally with what is happening here at home. As a journalist, I understand that now with what is happening in Iran, it is affecting us in South Africa, and it is greatly communicated in our media houses every day. KPMG was just talking about how the ongoing war in the Middle East might affect us locally. Media houses were able to even call your various experts to speak on issues like that, to warn the public of the issues that are happening globally that affect us locally. So I do think they're able to do that. You would have great journalists such as your Reddy Tlhabi speaking about what is happening in the US, even being able to try and attempt to at least defend South Africa, saying there is no genocide that is happening here. They want to impose sanctions, they're using tariffs, they're using all sorts of lies to make South Africa look like a bad country. Why? Because there are issues that are happening in Palestine, and South Africa is trying to stand up to that, to say, no, you cannot be killing children and innocent women, elderly people, for nothing, for making of the greater Israel.
Since the breakout of conflict under the second Trump administration, which specific issues have become the center of gravity for international news outlets?
They have mainly focused on this illegal Israel-Trump war that just shockingly happened while negotiations were taking place. So the breaking of international law has been a major concern to many media houses, because you would even hear your Wall Street Journal in America speaking about how this is actually going not to cause your global markets to fall, but it is also going to contribute to the falling of multilateral institutions such as the United Nations. They have been speaking about how international law seems to be undermined by the American administration. And I think for me, it is fear that is mostly playing out, because they just do not know who is next. 1 minute they're talking about Greenland, the other they're talking about Cuba. The Russians, the Chinas cannot be settled and think, no, they won't come close to us, because slowly but surely they're going after their partners. So that for me and for media houses, in my observation, has been something that has been worrisome to many.
Who are the main characters, leaders, nations, or groups being centered in these war narratives? And does this focus obscure a broader systemic failure of the rules-based order?
So we've got a number of people, and I will mention specifically Donald Trump. I will mention Benjamin of Israel, of course, Netanyahu. You have got Xi Jinping, you've got Vladimir Putin, you have got Maduro in Venezuela. And I'm mentioning this because if you look at the new 47th administration under Trump, they are targeting the rising global dominance of China and Russia specifically, because they see them as the greatest challengers in the game. And now they realize that if we do not stop these emerging powers through Maduro, who is very supportive of the East, Asia, your BRICS, and he is anti-imperialism, if we do not kidnap him and we allow this person to actually carry on leading Venezuela, we're going to have a problem of him supporting this growing multilateral institutions through your BRICS, which Maduro supports, and he openly does so, and he challenges your Western dominance. And therefore they went and destabilized the country to stall Venezuela, because it's now under the control of the US. They decide who must lead, when should elections take place. So they are done with that. Who's next? It's Cuba. Once they are done with those, it's over. Then who is the next focus? It is right next to your China and Russia, very close to them. You go to Iran, which is anti-Western. For me, it is the only nation, to be honest, that still believes and upholds its traditions, its culture, its way of doing things in Persia. They are Muslim and they still believe in their own ways. They do not allow your Western influence to infiltrate. What do? They have got the greatest oil ports in the country. They go destabilized because they know Russia, these growing emerging powers, rely on them. So what do? They go and destabilize, bomb those ports. They plant all sorts of things that don't exist in Iran in order to attack them. They send CIA to go and fund organizations to do this uprising against their own regime. So it tells you that America wants to target this number of people, including Israel, which is of course their proxy in the Middle East, being a center of your intelligence gathering and whatever sorts of evil things they do in Tel Aviv. So this is the administration that comes and says, we want America to dominate again. We want to force everyone to come and do things according to how we want them to be done. They target all these countries knowing that once we defeat them, then the only challenge that would be left is China and Russia. And they can start with China because Europe is already sending drones to bomb some of the cities in Russia, very close to your borders of Ukraine. They are already doing that. So they are already testing the ground. If they defeat Russia once more, they are left with your China and North Korea. After that, who else will stand up against them? Look at the multilateral institutions that should be speaking out against whatever wrongs that are happening in the world today. We're no longer looking at them. We're just focusing on people bombing other countries as they will for nothing. We're not focusing on the fact that there's inequality in South Africa. We are now focusing on how best to please the US administration so that they do not come and destabilize our country like they're doing in many parts of the world today. We are not focusing on how issues of land for Africans has never been addressed, how our minerals in Africa continue being extracted by the West. We're not focusing on the injustices of the past, how Europe still has to pay for what they did to Africa. We're not focusing on all those things. We're not focusing on them still colonizing us. We're not focusing on those great important things of at least making sure that we emancipate the black child. We're not focusing on that. We're focusing on just the fear of what could happen to us should the war come. We're not looking at how best we can actually do things better for not just African people, but for everyone in the world. So yes, I do believe that all these institutions have failed. If they had not failed, we would not be confronted with the issues that we're confronted with today.
Where are current news narratives falling short when discussing the political and legal implications of the conflict involving the Trump administration and its Israeli ally?
I think they are not being honest to say that what you're doing is actually wrong. It is not supposed to be done. They are always trying to justify their actions. Trump's actions, Israel's actions. Firstly, it was Israel has a right to defend itself. When we all knew it was never about that. It was about people that are displaced in Palestine because of Israel. Media houses never really call out the Prime Minister of Israel. The Israel state is treated as if though it is a special chosen one in the world. It is never accountable, and media houses are not really telling the truth. Here in South Africa, the narrative about Israel is different. When it comes to global issues, when it comes to even global partnerships that South Africa wishes to have with the East, which of course is not a bloc that would be dictating your policies and how you ought to do things in your country. Our very own local media houses will tell you we are trying to befriend communist Muslims because there is this Islamophobia that is happening now. They make them look like people that we should not partner with. They are wrong people who are all about wars and killing others. But you would see that today, Iran has never gone to America to bomb and do all these things that America does. They have always been in their country minding their own business. Even when they want to sanction them, they do as they please. And the West and their media houses always jump into supporting that narrative, forgetting that people have got their own interest. We do not have the same open book all over the world where we have to follow the culture of the West. And when you follow Islam, when you follow the way of the Persian, you are wrong. So our media houses are not really honest when it comes to the US administration and what it's doing. South Africa, for example, our very own organizations locally would be speaking about how we deserve to be sanctioned by the United States for partnering with these Asian countries, when America is actively trading with all those countries. But we are not allowed to do so because we should be treated like they are colonial states. So I don't think the media has been really doing a great work in actually telling what is happening and calling these people out. We have got leaders that are running the world at the moment who are doing wrong things. Speak of Epstein files. All of a sudden, no one is saying anything about Epstein. It's all about Iran, this country, they are bombing their uranium, they are doing this and that. Iran has killed 30,000, which we know is lies. Venezuela is not trafficking drugs to the United States, but media houses were supporting that narrative. So these guys are parasites. They look at who is in charge now. If we don't support their narrative, we're not going to be funded. Let's try to befriend them. So let's give them coverage to do as they please, and we cover their actions. We make them look like positive people when they're not. It happens locally, it happens everywhere. This is when you need media houses to intervene, to be the voices of the masses and speak for the people and not for the corporate capitalist.
Given the rise of the multipolar world narrative, where should the focus of social media users be to ensure a more nuanced understanding of these global power shifts?
They should focus on your United Nations. And the reason why I mentioned United Nations is because you can see that the United Nations, that is supposed to be like more of your global neutral police, has got no powers. It's been stripped of its powers. You have got a US administration under Donald Trump that has created the Board of Peace, for example. This Board of Peace led by the West. Many nations jumping into forking even this $1 billion that is needed for you to be part of that committee, the board. For example, now it's quiet. It's led by the West. We have always been led by the West as the world. They're not saying anything with what is happening around Venezuela. They are not saying anything about Iran as we speak. Iran, with a population of over 90 million people, is facing every day they have to dodge Israeli-US bombs, the greatest bombs in the world. So I think for me, social media narratives, personalities, influencers should focus on what is happening to actually understand the global shift, this multipolar world which we all aspired for. They should understand why we need to have at least alternative platforms where diplomacy is still respected, where diplomacy and other countries, sovereign nations are treated with the utmost respect they deserve, where you do not have at least one administration imposing its will on others. I will speak locally, where Africa, for example, needs to be treated with the respect that it deserves. It is not a country where you just come and go, and no one can defend themselves. No one can say anything, because if they do so, they are going to be sanctioned. They are going to be bombed. We need social media people, the narrative itself, to focus on the reasons as to why countries and nations are now looking east. Why all of a sudden we are saying, no, we want to be friends with China and Russia. China has never come to us and say, in order for you to work with us, you must remove these certain brands and you must implement these laws. No, they never do that. They come and want to create conditions that are better for us to work, respect each other. So I think social media needs to actually focus on South Africa at the moment. You know, the case we have before the ICJ. You look at it, we're standing there against the Western powers that are against South Africa, not just South Africa alone, including everyone in the world who says stop killing children. So we need to create platforms for people. We need to even point to areas where they need to look at and pay attention, so that they understand why we do not want this unipolar world, why we're moving into this multilateral platform institutions, that way we're saying, let the United Nations work, and if it doesn't work, let's create others. We need to teach people, because if we do not have social media people who always at least make sure that we get news as they come and they are unfiltered, if we do not have them playing a role in educating those who are sitting at home, those who are unemployed, those who have got no access to your television but have got phones and maybe data, to actually read what is happening in the world and be able to be educated, so that they also change their way of thinking and understand why we are all crying for this multipolar world.
To what extent is the multipolar narrative in news stories reflecting a genuine shift in power versus being used as a rhetorical tool by different political factions?
I always go back to the ICJ case, because the nature of the ICJ case, this is the global South coming out to defend its people, coming out to defend Palestine, coming out to say we are challenging the US and Israel and what they're doing there. The issues of US, Venezuela, South Africa's criticism of America and how it's continuing with its imperialism throughout the world. South Africa is continuing, and you look even within the GNU, you've got many parties that of course agree with South Africa partnering with your Russia, your China. So they do understand the narrative that is happening and is reported every day in our media spaces. They know these geopolitical shifts that are happening, this unipolar world that is slowly disappearing in emergence of this multipolar world that we are all trying to create. Our news media's narratives have always been very open and honest when it comes to that, making sure that nothing is filtered.
In the archives with JB.
Hi, it's JB here in the archives of people's stories. I think that's what history is, an archive of stories about people just like me and you. And for better or worse, they did things that changed the world in some way. Who knows, maybe one day it'll be you or someone you love. These days, I find myself in a bit of a crazy situation. I mean, I'm an American living here in Mzansi, and if our dodgy dealings with South Africa weren't enough, the US and Israel are now waging war on Palestine, Venezuela, and Iran. I know there's more to it than that, and honestly, the global landscape is becoming genuinely perilous. There's a massive amount of information out there, and it's all so heavily nuanced and complicated. But for me, one thing wins the prize for most mind-boggling: the concept of international law, also known as the law of nations. I saw it pop up a lot when I was reading about what America is doing to Venezuela, and then again with Iran. Now, noticing it everywhere, I decided I better figure out what it means. Like everything else in these archives, the what leads to the when and where. Hey Google, what is international law and where are its origins? International law is the set of rules, norms, and standards generally accepted in relations between nations. This is Gemini's definition, and while others are more detailed, they all lead me to wonder, so did a bunch of people just get together and agree on a set of rules, norms, and standards that would effectively govern an entire planet of countries and cultures? Not likely. Okay, Google, tell me about the evolution of international law. Well, I did ask, and when I started looking into all these search results, man, it's a lot. From Mesopotamia and Egypt to the early traditions of Islam, it seems like everyone brought something to the table. Wikipedia, Britannica, and other sites explain how the basics of international law go back as far as the dawn of recorded history. For instance, around 2450 BC in ancient Mesopotamia, the king of Lagash erected a stone monument that included terms for water rights and debt payments. Fast forward about 1,800 years, and over in Greece, the Greek lawmaker Solon did something that had a major influence on the social justice side of things. He canceled everyone's debts and made it illegal to sell yourself into slavery to pay bills. This was a huge early example of a law being used to protect human rights. Just a side note here, I read a story about how Solon made everyone promise to keep his laws for 10 years, and then he left the country so he wouldn't be tempted to change them. What a funny guy. Many nations and faiths help shape the concept of international law, but things really kicked off with the Romans. I read about this in a paper titled International Law, Milestones Throughout History by Riyad Hotul Muamala. It explained how the Romans developed ius gentius, or the law of nations. Originally, this was more or less a common-sense set of national laws based on what people knew to be fair. It served as a practical way for Rome to handle trade and travel between states. This era is often referred to when speaking of the Westphalian system. And I keep seeing something called the Peace of Westphalia. I wonder, is it Westphalia as in the West? Hey Google, what is the Peace of Westphalia? It turns out that while not quite as goofy as I was thinking, the name does refer to a region in northwestern Germany. The World History Encyclopedia says, signed on October 24, 1648, the Peace of Westphalia aimed to secure political autonomy for the multitude of small states that made up the Holy Roman Empire. Maybe its biggest contribution to what we know today is that it took those old law of nation ideas and turned them into a rigid rule. States, regardless of their size, have the right to govern themselves. But after the Roman Empire collapsed and the world split into little pieces, those old Roman ways became the ancestor of our modern idea that every nation has its own borders and its own power. Throughout our journey, one thing has been nagging at me. Why specifically do we use the word international? Why specifically do we call it international law? Why not global or universal or something like that? Earlier, I mentioned Rome's ius gentium, meaning the law of nations. Then later, in the Westphalian era, they were still calling it just gentium, which means the same thing. However, it is important to recognize that to say the law of nations rather than international law means something very different. Saying the law of nations implies one set of laws for all. International law, to me, says there are a set of laws created by a certain number of nations. Hey Google, tell me more about the word international. Interestingly, the eccentric English philosopher and wordmaker Jeremy Bentham first used the word international in 1780 in his book, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. You can read about him through the University College London Bentham Project. He was quite the SJW, and I wonder if he would be happy about the way the West has monopolized his word. I'm no scholar, but even I have read enough about this subject to pick up on a common thread. Sadly, it's a thread we've seen before. I think that the word international is not used by accident. Could it perhaps be that other words like global or universal would imply a set of laws made for everyone regardless of their national borders, religions, or culture? This topic is immense. I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface. The influence of international law reaches every aspect of the geopolitical landscape we see today. From aviation and the law of the sea to the ability to enter into armed conflict, everything is affected. Let's do this real quick. Hey Google, who are the key players governing international law today? There are a lot of players, and if you want to see a full list and their descriptions, you should check it out. Just to name a few, though, sovereign states, the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court. I have to know, what is a sovereign state? Wikipedia says, a state that has the highest authority over a territory. It is commonly understood that a sovereign state is independent. But look what I found. There's one player who wants all the credit. The United Nations says, among the greatest achievements of the United Nations is the development of a body of international law, which is central to promoting economic and social development as well as advancing international peace and security. Well, okay then. We should have skipped all this and just asked the UN, because they're doing such a great job so far. I believe that while these ideas came from all over, our modern system was built largely by and for Western powers to suit their own interests, ignoring any culture that didn't fit their civilized narrative. Civilized or not, I'll be seeing many things I read from now on in a different light. The law of nations has a lot to answer for. Until next time in our archives, remember, the story is as much in the wording as it is in the words. Words.
Beneath the headlines.
This edition's text analysis is done by two of the show's friends. They are no strangers to the People's Podcast, and we felt it was necessary to have them in tandem. They do not know each other, and I spoke to them independently, which made for interesting insights for me, and hopefully for you too. It's the politically savvy, journalistically wired, and matriarchal Lucy Antonatos. She's also a fine podcast producer. The other is author and columnist Kim Heller, forever spicy and opinionated on everything political, especially if it is anti-racism and anti-imperialism. What interested me about this piece wasn't necessarily the politics. Different as Lucy and Kim's may be from each other and from mine. It was where it was published, given its tone, mood, and line of argument. Because that act of publishing tells you something. The world is realigning visibly and rapidly, and some publications are clearly deciding they don't want to be left behind. Okay, enough with the preamble. My musings for later, right? The opinion that Lucy and Kim analyzed was published in the Financial Times. It is titled, "The Era of US Dominance in Economic Warfare is Over." And it's by Assistant Professor Nicholas Mulder from Cornell University. Off the bat, it goes without saying that the headline is direct and bold.
So there were quite a few words in the headline of this article that stood out for me. Era, dominance, economic warfare, and over. I think era really implies here that this is not a temporary situation or setback, but kind of like a turning point, a historical turning point. And what the author's suggesting is that there's a structural shift. Dominance is the second word in this headline that really stuck out to me. It's a very powerful noun. It's not a surprise, like we do associate dominance with the US, especially in geopolitical affairs, but it is a very forceful, powerful noun. Economic warfare, I thought, was interesting because of the juxtaposition, really, between the two terms that traditionally you wouldn't necessarily have put together. But in a way, I would argue they've now kind of become normalized in Trump's second term. He's been using warfare as maybe quite strong when thinking about tariffs. He has been using economic tools to punish foes and friends alike of the US. But that juxtaposition is interesting, and it shows the end of the era that was mentioned at the beginning of the headline. And the other word, over, I think it's just that it's so blunt and final. I mean, it's monosyllabic and it's not qualified. And I think it has a lot more impact than a word like waning or diminishing. It conveys a real sense of decisiveness.
That's Lucy, just as direct in her interpretation of the words that shot out at her from the title.
The words that almost sang out to me were US domination is over. Just the thought of US dominance coming to an end actually excited and thrilled me a little bit. It's not a headline you would see on a daily basis. If we look at the media hegemony and the worshipping of the West and the positioning of the US almost unrivaled as the empire of the world, I think journalists have tended to revere the United States rather than ever contemplating its downfall. So those words might sound ordinary, but to me they're quite extraordinary because they imply that could this be an end of an era of the US? That's why they had particular resonance with me.
And that's Kim explaining through a global South framing why some of those words land the way they do.
I think the publication Financial Times usually use let's say, more moderate language. So I think coming from this publication in particular, and I think that's why it interested me right from the beginning, was that it is almost a declaration that something's changing. And it's unusual that they would use, I believe, such a sensational type headline. Perhaps if it was in another publication, I wouldn't have reacted similarly. But the fact that it's come from here, almost the bastion of conservative journalism, to say US dominance is over, I think that statement is powerful. Are they saying there's a collapse? Are they saying everything is about to change? So I think it's quite sensational given the publication that it appeared in.
She brings in a point that led to my selection of this opinion. You see, it's one thing to analyze texts as we do on this podcast to understand the lens through which ideas are expressed and all the elements of critical literacy theory. But it is another thing entirely to look at the situating of that text, the context, timing, and audience are but a few of the elements that matter. For instance, it may not come as a surprise to see all types of obscenities in the boys' bathroom at a high school. But imagine the significance of those same obscenities, let's say graffiti, outside or, God forbid, inside the school principal's office. It's shocking, or I should refine that. Once upon a time, it was shocking. So, this type of opinion, this headline, as it were, would not ordinarily be amplified by a publication such as the Financial Times. But in terms of international relations and politics, this is not really a radical viewpoint, Lucy says.
He's taken a very traditional IR perspective in a way, like it's completely out of date now. In the post-war era, it's true that the US dominated the global economy. After the Second World War, it made up over 50% of the global economy, but now it makes up 19%. So, of course, that's a massive change, and that's really what's underlying all of this, which is something that he doesn't discuss in this article.
As much as I get it and agree, I still thought, ouch, because power is about more than economics. It's about dominance, projection, and perception. Yes, the US economic stronghold has been eroding since Europe's big war over 80 years ago. But through its proxies, the US was still able to boss the game for a long time. I didn't push that point with Lucy though. Mulder doesn't really go there, and besides, I'd only be defending the indefensible. Interesting though, isn't it? The sub-headline does give the reader some insight into where his thinking sits when it comes to US dominance. It reads, America has long used sanctions to coerce adversaries, but Iran and China can wield powerful economic weapons too.
I think it does refine the argument made in the headline. It clarifies what's meant by US dominance. So we're told, sanctions, that's clarifying that. It introduces two named actors in Iran and China. He's presenting a geopolitical argument. I think the word two at the end of the deck, it implies an equivalence now. America has done this for a long time and now others are doing it as well. He's not taking a position. He's setting up his article as something that's going to be analytical.
So I think that's very interesting because the scholar who wrote this is an expert in sanctions and explaining the potent role of sanctions within warfare. The interesting thing here is that the very same economic weapons that America has been using for words, which is sanctions, and sanctions are very powerful weapons, it now shows that those that it's imposed these things on are now fighting back using the same weaponry. It's quite a complex and telling subheading. It's almost like a checkmate situation for the opponents of the US, because what the article implies and the subheadline implies is that rivals of the United States in the shape of Iran and China are now using the same trickery that the United States has always used, almost calling its bluff, turning the ship around and firing that against the United States, who is the original protagonist.
Given these takes by Lucy and Kim on what is evidently the thesis of this opinion piece, does the author overtly make this argument throughout? Our two analysts made some observations in that regard.
The explicit messages are that US dominance and economic coercion is over, and this is reinforced through the examples of China and Iran that he gives. So Chinese export controls, that's an explicit message of his article. Another explicit message is that sanctions as a tool are broadly failing and counterproductive. And he uses a range of global examples to support that argument. And he also posits that economic warfare escalates into real warfare. I mean, his conclusion that the US attacks on Venezuela and Iran undermine the claim that sanctions are preferable alternative to open war is extraordinary. I mean, he relies heavily on accumulation to reinforce his arguments in the article. I mean, each paragraph adds another example, another country, another failure, so that by the end the reader feels there's a mountain of evidence, even if the individual examples, when you actually look at them, are quite compressed.
He speaks about America and its weaponry of economic bullying, being sanctions, how that hasn't stopped and how they've actually just created a fleet of enemies. That is all in part of building the story of America's perpetual reign over the world through its desire to access all the energy resources, control oil, making sure that these critical resources don't get into the hands of its key rivals, how it tends to attack rather than negotiate with its rivals. And that is economic warfare. Economic warfare and domination doesn't have to be achieved on the barrel of a gun. It can be achieved equally efficiently through sanctions. But he clearly states that sanctions have consequences. And the irony, the twist in the story is that now economic sanctions are being turned against America. The arrogance of the United States to not think that the strait would be closed, that channels and corridors of trade would be closed to them, because they're so used to using that against others. But now when it's being used against them, they don't appreciate the rules of the game, the very rules that they have imposed. So it's almost like this great bully is being dealt with and he's being killed and damaged through his own armory. And I think there's a bit of irony and poetic justice in that.
The author's opinion leans heavily on the idea of economic might or demise being centered on energy supplies. Considering how openly this is emphasized and re-emphasized throughout, I found myself pondering the silent messages behind it, initially with Kim and then with Lucy.
You've pinpointed something that I thought possibly needed to be given more attention because it's dealing with broader concepts. The author gives details about some of the sanctions imposed by the United States, but he doesn't really deal with the outcome of the energy crisis, what this really means. What does it mean particularly for the global south who have been under the whip of the United States for generations. He doesn't really break that down and what it means for the ordinary person. Perhaps that's not to be found in such a high-level economic review, but I think it could have provided very, very valuable insights, and perhaps that's what's missing.
I mean, the piece does mention that Iran's blockade cuts off 20% of global oil and gas flows and a third of the global fertilizer trade. And he does say that, this has forced a temporary relaxation of Russian oil sanctions, but he doesn't really engage with the differential vulnerability of different economies to that energy shock. And Europe and Asia, I mean, particularly countries like Japan, South Korea, Bangladesh, are far more exposed to Gulf energy disruption than the US. So it's interesting that he's not engaging with that at all. I mean, he mentions the fertilizer trade disruption, but it's only like a passing mention, and that will affect the global south the most. For an article that's sort of claiming that this is a global phenomenon, the human costs are conspicuously absent.
Outside of that, Lucy points to something else that is important, something the author leaves unmentioned.
I mean, I do think it's particularly striking in this article that he doesn't mention the JCPOA, which was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or what's also known as the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And this was a deal that was aimed at limiting Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions release. It's strange that it's not included because Iran is the central case in this article. And I mean, in fact, sanctions had brought Iran to the table, and there was a multilateral diplomatic framework that was, some would argue, successfully containing nuclear proliferation, but the US withdrew from it in 2018. The subsequent sort of reimposition of maximum pressure is the missing link in his argument. The escalation he describes, it wasn't the inevitable consequence of sanctions, but of abandoning a sanctions-backed agreement that was working. The structural inevitability that the author is trying to posit here, it doesn't exist.
But as Kim says, this is a high-level piece, and perhaps the subliminal issues we are teasing out would have done little to strengthen the argument being made. This then makes you wonder whether the author argues his point consistently and whether he challenges his own assumptions.
The author's argument is consistently linear through this article. I mean, every example that he uses confirms his thesis, and each paragraph advances his argument. And the author does gesture towards complexity in noting that the failure of sanctions is a widespread phenomenon. But this is actually a reinforcement of his argument and not a challenge to it. There is some contradiction there at the end, because earlier in the article, he's talked about China and how they responded to Trump's tariffs effectively by imposing a sort of economic weapons of their own. And they basically weren't exporting critical minerals to the US, and this affected US manufacturers. And so then they forced Trump effectively into a climb down in October 2025. So actually, those weapons did work, and they didn't result in a military war between the US and China. So that does kind of contradict what he says at the end, that for a long time one could argue that sanctions were, despite their imperfect record, at least a preferable alternative to open war. After the US attacks on Venezuela and Iran, this claim no longer seems convincing. And then he says, instead of averting military action, sanctions are now just as frequently paving the way to violent escalation. Well, in that case, they didn't pave the way to violent escalation. In the conclusion, there's kind of a shift in tone. He's definitely setting it up at the beginning as an analytical piece, which it was, throughout. Okay, there was a development of his argument. There wasn't really much of a counter-argument going on, but it was a kind of analysis still in tone. And at the end here, it changes in tone. It's from kind of analysis to warning.
I told Lucy that I found the author a little intellectually disingenuous, purely on the basis of rigor. Granted, we cannot cover every base of our argumentation, but it is a folly not to acknowledge that the limitations of your argument lie in exactly the kinds of examples Lucy mentioned. It is a stretch to decisively conclude that economic punishment, as egregious as it may be, no longer achieves desired outcomes or fails to avert war. Kim, though, seems to believe that the argument in this opinion piece is built consistently and is well established.
I think he develops it with a provocative headline, an image one has to think about, and by setting out America's economic sabotage of many countries around the world, which clearly shows America is the bad guy. And I think his message is very clear. I think he's very consistent. He just builds his argument through different devices, whether they're graphic, very emotive language, deliberately so. And I think his message, what comes out very clear, is that sanctions are part of a very, very dangerous weapon, and that they don't ever bring peace, they bring war. They can trigger world wars, and that's what we're also seeing at the moment. And I think one of the stories underplayed in the current war against Iran is how, for 4 or 5 decades now, this country has had to limp under the most vicious Western-imposed sanctions. And has that led to good things? Has it pressurized the country leadership to accept terms of engagement that America wants? No, not at all. It's now led to the most awful war, which is affecting millions across the globe. So I think the author is very committed to that message, that sanctions are a dangerous weapon.
Let us now turn to some of the devices Kim mentioned, in particular, the image used by the publication.
To me, it looks like a generic picture. You know, when you see a picture that's become iconic, I had thought at first it was a huge warship coming from one of the great imperial powers, such as the United States or the UK. But looking closer, it looks like it's a huge oil tanker. And perhaps that's significant in itself, because at the heart of the economy is oil. So oil is almost symbolic of the economic currency. So perhaps this picture is showing the explosive nature of what this conflict is doing.
We see a damaged cargo ship on the water. And I think that the fact that there's a fire on board, there's black smoke billowing from the ship, and I think the fact that it's a civilian, not a military, a civilian commercial vessel, it conveys a kind of sense of physical vulnerability in what's happening. And it's showing us in the image the human cost of economic warfare, because they're not combatants. It's a cargo ship, it's trade, it's supply chains, it's ordinary commerce. And so this ship in the image, it acts as a metaphor for the global economy. What was interesting, and this is more from the caption underneath the photo, we know that the nationality of the vessel is Thai. So it's not American or Iranian. And I think that's also significant because it shows us that the damage is going far beyond these two countries that are at war with each other. And it suggests that economic warfare injures third parties, not just the kind of main protagonists.
It would either have been that image or some explosive bombs that were being dropped so casually in today's world. The play of young boys rather than the dangerous games of world leaders. That probably would be the image one would expect. You know, we've become accustomed to that. So I think there's something almost more sinister in the symbol, this huge oil ship tanker. I think it's quite elegant rather than, it doesn't revert to the normal lazy imagery. I think it's a well thought through image, and I think it was certainly put there to evoke emotional reaction from perhaps investors in oil, financial barons and the sort.
We know that Asia is being hit far harder by the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz and other regions. So it's interesting that they chose a Thai ship. I don't know if they did that on purpose, but that is really significant because already Asian countries are having to ration gas and electricity, and schools have switched to remote teaching, offices are closed, there's no air conditioning. I think it's a very good photo for this piece. I did take issue with the second sentence of the caption, where it says the entire world is experiencing the damage that broad-based economic coercion can inflict. And I guess it's meaning in terms of Iran's economic coercion here, but it's in response to military aggression. So I think that is quite misleading. I think that it's this idea that he's putting that economic sanctions lead to warfare, when actually that isn't necessarily the case.
As y'all may know, I am blind. So imagine my thoughts as I heard Kim describe the ship as an oil tanker with a certain clinical precision versus Lucy's cargo ship, which carried more of a human dimension. Sighted folks, hey? Seriously though, I love this part of critical media literacy precisely because it reminds me of how much I take in from the world through those around me, but more importantly, how in stories, viewers and readers are primed to go down a particular path. Think about how these two commentators concluded so differently on whether the author's argument was consistent or inconsistent. Let's carry on. No doubt, the ship is not a military vessel and it is damaged, and the fact that there is smoke tells me as a reader that something is cooking, or that the US dominance is up in smoke. Poor choice of words, I know.
My main issue with this is not the image or the headline or the deck. It's the second sentence of that caption, which I think is really misleading.
What's the caption in full?
The caption in full is a Thai cargo ship after an attack in the Strait of Hormuz. And then the entire world is experiencing the damage that broad-based economic coercion can inflict. And I would argue that that image of a cargo ship that's been clearly targeted by some weapon is not showing us the damage that broad-based economic coercion can inflict, because the whole thing about economic coercion is that you're trying to avoid war. You're using other means to change the behavior of a state. You're not resorting to violence.
That's Lucy's way of saying that the photo caption creates a disconnect. It makes her pause and think about how it is positioning her. Had it not been for that incongruent message, the picture would have been a perfect fit. As it stands though, the image does appear to be in sync with the article, reinforcing and complementing it. Kim agrees that the photo itself is not in opposition to the article.
No, I don't think it contradicts it, because oil is at the basis of everything. Oil is also motivating Donald Trump to be so aggressive in Venezuela, in Iran. He's got an oil addiction. So I think it's a more sophisticated approach. Perhaps the ordinary reader who passes by this wouldn't necessarily make the connection. But I don't think this is a mainstream type of article. I think it's an article that tries to provoke and challenge thinking. So therefore, I don't think that it's out of sync with the content of the article. I think it makes one think. This was one of the more intriguing articles that I've read because it was unexpected in many ways. So I think the picture lends that. You have to kind of think before you read. And perhaps that's what the author is inviting us to do.
The other devices are found in the opening paragraph of the piece. Lucy explains the use of language in captivating the reader and setting up the thesis.
He has a summary lead, so his first sentence sets up what he's talking about.
It reads, Iran's effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has sent shockwaves through the global economy.
And it's an immediate real-world event, and he uses the present tense and dramatic metaphors, shockwaves. Later in the paragraph uses choke points. And in doing this, he creates a kind of sense of urgency. And then he quickly pivots with the word but, and he introduces a reframing that goes to the core of his argument, that Iran hasn't invented something new, but has replicated an American tactic. And I think he quite effectively, in this first paragraph, establishes an equivalence between Iran's blockade and America's sanctions. And you could argue that he therefore dispels any assumption that US economic coercion is legitimate, while Iran's is not. And he uses this kind of neutral formula, replicated a tactic. So he's taking the emotion out of it.
Kim found the inversion of narrative intriguing. Usually, America is cast as the savior, yet because of the author's play on words, a new narrative arises.
His wordplay is very interesting because he goes in immediately, and instead of telling the usual story, he kind of flips the script, if that makes sense. He immediately puts Iran as perhaps the hero of the story rather than as the bad guy. So I think just the wordplay is quite provocative.
With all of that said, who are the readers likely to be receptive to this piece, given its placement? And how do they differ from those inclined to reject what it sets out? First, Kim.
The readers of this publication, unless I'm misinformed, would be quite highly situated conservative readers, financial readers, readers that want to keep the markets as they are. So I find that this would be a challenging read for them because they always want to see America as the hero, as a country that cannot be brought down by others. And yet we've seen suggestions that indeed this is what's happening. Global South scholars and more progressive policy analysts and geopolitical specialists who have been questioning the Western hegemony and power relations, I think would welcome this article, particularly that it's written almost in an anti-American, defeatist type of way, as if the world is set to change and that America is potentially losing its top position as the top dog.
And now, Lucy.
I think the ideal reader of this piece would be somebody who's engaged in international affairs, maybe a policymaker, a journalist, somebody who works in international markets, energy markets, somebody who's studied international relations or economics, somebody who works in trade of some description. Those people would be receptive to his analysis and comfortable with the idea that there are limits to American power. And I think these are the kind of readers that would know of the counterexamples that are missing from this article themselves, like South Africa or the JCPOA or Cuba. An American foreign policy hawk would definitely object to the moral equivalence implied between US sanctions and Iranian blockades at the beginning of the article.
Yes, go on.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's this idea that, Iran is sort of some kind of evil country and, any kind of comparison between Iran and the US would be rejected. Resistant readers would also be those who do still believe in economic sanctions and that in the effectiveness of them, I mean. They might be somebody who subscribes to this paper, but they would disagree with the argument that he's putting forward. They would see that he's built this argument, he's used concrete examples, but he's only used examples that suit his argument. He hasn't thought to include things that actually contradict his thesis. He's not engaging with that, and they would take issue with that.
The conclusion. Post-analysis and commentary with Malusi Ngala.
When I made my predictions about a geopolitical realignment being inevitable, that change was coming, I did not expect us to have reached a point, certainly not by 2026, where the process would be fast-tracked. In 2024, I thought we would be steadily drudging along, with the occasional significant moment propelling events forward at a trot. Thanks to Pinky and the Brain, we are moving, and at quite a pace. That is my immediate read of what US and Israeli actions under Trump and Netanyahu, respectively, are amounting to. Monkey see, monkey do. You see, where some are missing the point is in thinking that Trump is the root of all evil, whereas the man is simply doing what is expected of him. Contrary to what some of his fans turned critics are now saying, this will eventually lead to an America First moment of reckoning. Just not in the way his base imagined. The US will have no choice but to focus inward, as mega supporters have always wanted. Why? Because the world will be isolating it or dealing with it strictly on an as-needed basis. Unfortunately for those who were quick to defend the status quo, whether in South Africa or elsewhere, particularly in Europe, the ugliness of the system is now laid bare for all to see. Any other occupant of the Oval Office would have made this far more difficult to confront. For those of us who already accept that change is necessary. The neoliberal order does not serve me, and it does not serve you, even if you think its trinkets are worth having, while you cast a cautionary eye at those without a roof over their heads or food on the table. The occasional gasp of outrage in a WhatsApp group or at a conference will not make the world fair and just. Now action is required. Either you walk the talk or you sit it out. You shape up or ship out. You put up or shut up. The Iranian people, the Palestinians, Venezuelans, and peoples across the global south are suffering and paying the ultimate price at this pivotal moment. The question is whether we will make it count or let another opportunity slip by. When the dust settles, the US will have to come to terms with the fact that it's no longer the preeminent global power it once was. It may even find itself sitting further from the table of power brokers by virtue of how chaotic its conduct has become and how far it has fallen in the eyes of the world. In terms of concrete shifts, consider this. The closure or threatening closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, is already forcing nations to rethink trade routes and, dare I say, to rethink multilateralism altogether. That choke point being disrupted doesn't just affect energy markets, it forces a fundamental recalculation of how global commerce move. South Africa, for one, should be asking itself what opportunities the Cape of Good Hope route is presenting right now. This is not a new conversation. The Cape route was the dominant artery of world trade for centuries before the Suez Canal opened in 1869 and redirected much of the traffic. We're now watching a reversal of that dynamic unfold in real time. Since the Red Sea crisis escalated in late 2023 with Ansar Allah, whom Western media calls the Houthis, retaliatory action forcing major shipping companies to route traffic through the Cape of Good Hope has surged dramatically. Vessels carrying oil, gas, consumer goods, and manufactured cargo are already rounding our coastline in significantly greater numbers. This is not speculation. It is happening. But recognizing the opportunity is only the beginning. South Africa's ports need to be up to the standard that such a moment demands. Durban, as the busiest port on the African continent, carries particular responsibility here. Infrastructure investment, port efficiency, and logistics capacity are not optional extras. They are the price of entry if South Africa is to position itself as a serious node in this reconfigured global trade architecture. And sovereignty is essential in all of this. In a previous episode, we talked about what actually happened at the G20 in November 2025. Ramaphosa signed what he himself called an unprecedented memorandum of understanding with the European Union on critical minerals, standing alongside EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The language sounded promising: beneficiation, processing at the point of extraction, moving up the value chain, and so forth. But here is the question GNU administration has not answered clearly enough. On whose terms exactly? Africa currently captures less than 5% of the value generated from its own minerals, resources the world is now scrambling to have. The EU was not sitting across the table out of generosity. They are stockpiling rare earth minerals and urgently diversifying supply chains away from China, and South Africa is a strategic resource to them. What guarantees were secured for ordinary South Africans? What oversight does Parliament have? That detail has not been made sufficiently transparent to the public. The GNU's administration's dealings carry more than a faint whiff of old postures, where the people's needs were an afterthought and a narrow circle of politicians and connected business persons benefit. Ramaphosa, standing next to von der Leyen, making grand declarations, is not the same as the people of Limpopo or the Northern Cape, whose land sits atop these minerals, having a meaningful say in what happens to their ground. That is the accountability gap that must be closed. That cannot stand, but only the people can ensure that it doesn't. Because where the people are concerned, the consequences are generational and far more damning than anything a Trump or a Netanyahu will ever personally have to face.
Vele, upemi BP.
No, Ndwana, I'm just thinking of shoving this BB up Satan's Yahoo. Oh, Father, will this world ever know peace? I think of your servant's words when he says, "And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never." Thank you for joining us for this edition of The Thinking Behind It All. It was executive produced by me, Melusi Ngala. Music and sound engineering by DJ Darkness. Assistance production by Naledi Ngala and JB. Assistant researcher Isaac Ngala. And field reporting by Isaac Ngala and Matibedi Musiwe. Contributions by Thabo Makwakwa. And text analysis is by Lucy Antonados and Kim Heller. Please tell your friends, lovers, and family about the podcast. Until next time, think before you speak. Sharp, 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 sharp.